Dzień dobry. Witam drugiego dnia konferencji. Mam nadzieję, że Państwo...
Welcome everyone to day 2 of our conference. I hope you had a very good evening last night. We are just about to begin our next panel discussion. Before we do, I have some technical information for you, very important from the perspective of the organizers. Those of you staying here at the hotel need to leave your rooms, check out before lunch. Our lunch is going to be served at level -2, 2 levels below where we are now. There is a lift, you can take the stairs as well. At 1:30 we are going to have lunch. Please remember to return your headphones to our technicians. If there are any that are lost, we will have to pay for them. Hopefully this is not going to happen. Can I ask Bartosz Bartosik from the quarterly WIŚD to take over as moderator now? Please invite our panelists on stage.
Dzień dobry Państwu. Dziękuję bardzo Rafale za to wprowadzenie.
Good morning, Rafał. Thank you very much for your kind words of introduction. It is my great pleasure to be able to moderate session 1 today on the second day of our conference. We're going to have unique guests whom I would like to present to you. The title of the panel discussion is People and War, the Impact of the War on Human Attitudes. Our time is limited. For this reason, I would like to invite, without any further ado, our panelists, Hanna Machińska, former Deputy Ombudsman, a lawyer. Thank you for the applause. Reverend Professor Andrzej Kobyliński, Philosopher, Head of the Chair of Ethics at the Cardinal Stefan Wyszyński University in Warsaw. And our special guest, who has arrived from Ukraine, Father Serhiy Dmytriyev, military chaplain of the Ukrainian army, director of the ELEOS-Ukraine.
W pięknej wyszywance, pięknie. Raz, działa wszystko. Raz, działa wszystko. Tak, można sprawdzić mikrofony.
Nie działa?
Tak, sprawdźmy mikrofony, ewentualnie czy...
Let us check our microphones. Hopefully they are fine. Father Serhiy, can you hear the interpreters as well? Interpretation to Ukrainian. I think that the subject of our panel this morning is perhaps the most universal of all our panel discussions during this conference, because when we speak about different interhuman relations, the war in Ukraine is something that we have all very keenly felt. It has an impact on everyone, and certainly the impact is different on the Ukrainians, Poles, Italians or Brazilians. This geographical dimension seems to be very important, and this, I think, has been already voiced before during this conference, and also those attitudes, relations, they can be characterized by certain dynamics. The war perhaps had a different impact on us in February 2022, and probably, I think so at least, its impact is different today. Can we perhaps discuss this broad range of different possible attitudes when faced with war in Ukraine? Our guest from Ukraine knows very well the situation, both along the front line, because he has visited this place. He was active there, and also he is an expert in charitable actions, as ELEOS-Ukraine is man in charge of humanitarian and supports charitable actions. Father Serhiy, can we start on a personal note, perhaps? What was the impact of the war on you, your relatives, the closest to you, and the Ukrainians in general? Thank you. I will speak Ukrainian. Well, my Polish is not that good. I understand Polish, but I will prefer to choose to speak in Ukrainian.
Коли ми говоримо про війну, для нас в Україні
When we speak about the war, for us in Ukraine, this is the war that started already in 2014. For me, the Ukrainians, for my friends, for my church, it is already the 9th year of the war. We can still go back to the Revolution of Dignity in 2014, when we Ukrainians spoke out in defense of European values, freedom of speech, freedom of religion. We spoke out in defense of everybody's individual freedom, presenting our disagreement to the totalitarian regime. Still today, we can see the negative elements of our life under the previous regime. My life changed very much in 2014. For 18 years, I was a priest belonging to the Moscow Patriarchate, and at that time, together with a group of people, faithful, we decided to move to the Ukrainian church in Kherson. It was a radical change of my life. I started to serve as a military chaplain in Zachal, in the Volhynia region. There were soldiers there of the Zhytomyr, Volyn regions. 70% of the soldiers there were Orthodox faithful. About 30% were actual Poles, Catholic Poles. Serhiy, who was the head of my battalion, was an ethnic Pole. And many of the soldiers in my battalion were ethnic Poles. I myself also feel Polish. I've got documents documenting my Polish origin, so I actually have several times also celebrated Christmas. As you remember, there were different dates of Catholic and Orthodox Christmas. I remember celebrating a Mass for the Roman Catholics on the day of their Christmas. Still in 2014, people had problems. How priests, especially from a non-canonical Orthodox Church, could actually celebrate Mass for Roman Catholics. We also set up an organization similar to Caritas that focused on the help to soldiers, also civilians. It was a organization, a social organization, you can say. As there is, according to Ukrainian legislation, churches may not receive support from abroad. We decided to set up this non-religious organization. At this moment, we've got a number of different projects and significant investments related. The most important one, perhaps, was a unique for Ukraine. This was about supporting women in the context of the conflict, those who suffered because of the Russian invasion. About 40,000 of confirmed cases were women who were held captive and tortured.
це рік від 4 років до 86.
Many of the women were tortured, raped. Actually, their age is between 4 and 48 years of age, or even older. So many cases when the women were raped by the Russians. Very often this was done in front of their families and children, husbands. Many of those events were also in some way supported by the Russian Orthodox Church. Alexander Mień has been mentioned before. He was murdered. But not many speak about many Ukrainian Orthodox priests. We know more perhaps about some Protestant priests who also lost their life. Some of them burned in their car. Our life changed very much because for our organization, I think for any organization, charitable institution, the war is a test of humanism, our human dignity. We need to support our neighbor, and the parable on the Samaritan. We need to, I think, follow this example. The churches should support the life of everybody, no matter what their religion. We've got representatives here at this conference of Crimean Tatars. Also, he, as a Muslim, has been able to present his position. There was a time when actually we were able to use Muslim mosques for celebrating our services when we had no access to our Orthodox churches.
Що сталося з моєю родиною? Моя родина, моя донька живе в Німеччині зараз.
My daughter lives now in Germany. She was able to live before the war. She left for Poland, then to Germany. She's safe. My office, my family moved after the outbreak of the war. Now I'm in Ivano-Frankivsk. I was active along the front line. Now I'm staying further away from the front line, but still there running the foundation. I realized that we never know what's going to happen on the following day. We actually have a number of letters of proxy for 5 different people, just to make sure that we know what happens if some of us are killed.
Dziękuję bardzo za to bardzo poruszająca też opowieść.
Thank you very much. A very touching testimony. I will give the floor in a while to Hanna Machińska and priest Kobyliński. Can I still ask another question? Yes, this is the 10th year of the war in Ukraine. But the year 2022 and the escalation of the war, how do you see it? Is it a special moment, a breakthrough that actually changed the situation in Ukraine? I'm asking because I had a look at some surveys when we speak about Ukraine and different human attitudes. I saw that a few years ago, after 2014, the attitudes to the Russians was quite diverse, while today I think 5 or 6% have a positive attitude towards the Russian, according to the polls, and it was much higher before. Do you see any change also there, Father?
8 років війни, коли нам не допомагали зброєю.
For 8 years of war, we had not been receiving any military assistance. Many people in Ukraine would say that these are internal issues. By the way, the Russian propaganda was very active both in Europe and in Ukraine, and we had very little support from other countries. So the war in Ukraine was simply not perceived. People were not taking notice, and thus Russians decided that they can play even harder and attack harder. Now, the Moscow Patriarchate, we decided that it's a political organization. There is no point in having a dialogue with them. And as a result, we saw the escalation of war that happened in 2022. What I'm saying is not maybe politically correct, but the thing is, Russia showed its true colors, its true face. And that is when the whole world saw what Russia is like and what the Russian Orthodox Church is like. You can go to Radio Svoboda website. There you will see a material where a member of the clergy is selling weapons. These are facts, undeniable facts. And these instances are quite common. Now, we saw what certain politicians cooperating with Russians do, We took notice, and that was an eye-opener.
Відкрили очі. І для нас це було важливо.
Now another question. Well, or rather, a very similar question that I'm going to put to two other guests. In other words, the attitudes, how the war impacted us. By the way, if you would like to share your own experience, your own reflections, do so, do share it, and tell us about the Polish attitude, what the Poles feel. And please pay attention to your own fields of expertise, that is human rights and ethics. Ladies and gentlemen.
Proszę Państwa, to myślę, że ta wojna...
This war has left a mark on our life, an indelible mark. Now, my generation is not the generation of the war, but rather the first generation that came after the war. So what we remember are stories or images that were passed on to us by our parents and grandparents, and these are the images of that terrible war. Now, in Poland, to a different degree, we have been confronted with the images that are coming from Ukraine. Let me, if I may, share my own personal experience. It was the second day of the war. Now, the representative of the Ombudsman's office found themselves at the Polish-Ukrainian border, at a number of places at this border, and there we were giving our support. We were trying to coordinate, help to organize it. So what was it that I saw there? It was the second day of the war.
Czyli właściwie drugiego dnia wojny.
What I saw was terrible human misfortune. It was mostly women and the elderly that were fleeing at the time, and we saw the image of the war in their faces, in their eyes. We saw this tragedy of the people who were running away with hardly anything material, saw crying children. We talked to those women, all of them uncertain of what is going to happen to them. And this is the image, these are the pictures that I will always have before my eyes. And mind you, these are just the war refugees. We are not talking at this point about the people that died in Ukraine, and people started dying quite soon. What we saw here was this amazing response, this social response, and that made us quite, optimistic. All hands on deck, basically. We all saw that it was our patriotic duty to help so that those Ukrainian refugees could reorganize their lives. It's a bit paradoxical, but this war reinforced our social response. We are stronger for it. We know that we can do things. We have agency. And it's our duty to help our brothers and sisters in Ukraine. We know that we form a certain unity. And that was quite amazing. And another thing, well, it should not have been so, but we did things that the state should have been doing. And yes, the state built certain legal framework with the assistance of the European Union, but the everyday assistance that was provided was what regular people did, and
ludzie, którzy jeździliśmy po dworcach, organizowaliśmy, patrzyliśmy. Gdyby nie nasi...
It was the regular citizens, average people that were helping. Without them, the system would have collapsed. The state itself was unable to come up with such large-scale help. It was about basic existence, accommodation, first of all. The state was not ready. It had not done its homework. It was not ready for a catastrophe of that scale.
I powiem Państwu jedną rzecz, że bałam się na samym początku, tego.
At the very beginning, I was quite anxious. I was anxious and I was afraid that this wave of enthusiasm and help might simply dissipate with time, because this is what we do, we people do. We get used to evil. Evil that we experience with time becomes just a part of our lives. Now, you can look at the polls. The polls, recent polls, say that 26% of respondents believe that the scale of assistance of help should be minimized, that the Ukrainians want too much, that there is competition. It's 26% of the society. 56% of our society continues to believe that we need to stand by them, to support them and to help them.
I trzymajmy się i dbajmy o to, żeby to nie było.
And this 56 is the minimum. I believe that the Ukrainians very well merged with our system, the legal system, the economic system, and they are very close to us in terms of how they think. Basically, what I'm talking about is our duty. And another thing, I'll return to it later. Now, Philip González Morales, special UN rapporteur, paid a visit here in Poland, and he looked at two borders, Polish-Belarusian, Polish-Ukrainian border. And his report was presented at the Human Rights Council. Now, the Polish-Ukrainian border report is very positive indeed, and though there are certain issues there, namely the children have not been sufficiently included in the education system. The rapporteur stresses that the Ukrainians have been provided with accommodation, but this assistance has been provided by regular people rather than the state. And thirdly, the rapporteur concluded the following. The Polish law is very restrictive when it comes to abortion, and thus it is impossible to abort pregnancy. And remember that many of those women here fell victim of rape. They've been raped, and the Polish state is not sufficiently supportive in this situation. But generally, the report is quite positive, and basically it's a tribute paid to the people. Let me add one thing here. Professor, please accept my apology. The first day was quite striking for me. Why was that? I saw that Ukrainians at the border were divided into two groups. The first one were Ukrainians, and the second one were the third state countries, students that studied in Ukraine from various African countries. They were processed or were being processed separately, and we tried to act there. And the third group that I believe is being discriminated against, namely Roma, the Romani people, and their situation is quite dramatic. Now, had it not been for this fundamental help provided by NGOs, today we would see Roma family living in the streets. Without that help, those Roma would have been left without any help. So yes, people, or rather Poland is quite well received, but there are some issues there and there is room for improvement. Ladies and gentlemen, I personally was not surprised that the war broke out, but I was surprised by the scale and brutality. Since 2007, since the Munich conference, it's been clear that the war broke out, and the Russian president said that the Soviet Union needs to be restored and the old order in Europe and the world needs to be restored. And then Georgia happened. And I basically wrote about it a number of times, writing that the Russian imperialism is on the rise again, and we had to analyze what communism was, what post-communism is, and how evil is being reborn in Russia. So, 2014 and 2022, they were no surprise for me. Now, the brutality was a surprise. I had been reading a number of American works on the subject, and the Americans believed that it would be a hybrid war, information-based war, a cyber war. But I was actually surprised to see conventional war. Now, the war had changed certain things in the world, namely the old order, the Cold War-like order, had been restored, especially when it comes to the third world countries. Just have a look. Throughout the Cold War, the emerging economies, the growing countries, the third world countries, Asia, Africa, South America, they sympathized with the USSR rather than the US, and then it changed. In the last 30 years, this global order has been different because we had this one hegemon, that is the US. Well, for better or for worse, this is what we had for 3 decades. And that finished when the last American soldier boarded a plane in Kabul in Afghanistan. It was 2021. And then another chapter, Russia invaded Ukraine. So look at the global south, those developing countries, Asia, Africa, and South America. They do not sympathize with Ukraine, Poland, or Central and Eastern Europe. No, they obviously sympathize with Moscow, and it's something worth bearing in mind, because that is something that impacts Christians in general, or Catholics specifically. Ask Brazilian Catholics about the war, what they think about it, not to mention the African countries. When you hear the responses, you'll be terrified. I'm speaking about Catholics only, and they'll be holding a bit of a grudge because they say that they are too focused on this particular war. To them, this particular war is one of many wars. And they are complaining quite loudly at times that we here in Europe, we are too focused on this Russo-Ukrainian war, and we keep forgetting or tend to forget about wars that are ongoing in other corners of the world. And this is quite a challenge when it comes to looking for the right balance in the world of Christianity. After all, today we need to work on it. Now, speaking from my own experience, I have not been helping much personally. Because of my profession, I was involved mostly intellectually. I would be writing hundreds of comments and analyses that I published. I explained what the Orthodox Church is, how the religion is linked to politics in Russia, what the oligarchic system in Russia is, what Russian post-communism is. These analyses were very much needed here in Poland, I believe, and we still need them. I believe that Russia continues to be a great riddle, even here in Poland, not to mention Western Europe. And the last thing, I work with ethics, with philosophy. Now, academically speaking, what's been happening for a year now is, well, a period of harvest, because there are so many things that we can work on. Now, ethics. We analyze what people do, their attitudes. And here you can quote bellum justum, this notion that was discussed yesterday. And throughout centuries, you had three levels of analysis of that very notion. The first was jus ad bellum. So what we analyzed before the war actually breaks out. Have we done everything to make sure that the war doesn't break out? You know, the diplomatic efforts, the education in various countries. So what was done to make sure that the war doesn't happen? And here we are looking at a great question. Here in Europe, how do we assess the guilt of the people who led to this war? This is more of a political analysis, I would say, but nobody here wants to actually tackle that issue, and a large part, or rather many European politicians, when you say jus ad bellum, so many politicians, I would say, here would be responsible morally too. A large part of the European political class is co-responsible, and I believe that a time will come in the next years and decades when we're going to analyze that. Now the second level.
So the second is about the ethical principles that should be applied during the war. Help for the refugees, for instance, which types of weapons can be used, which should not use in bello. What kind of humanitarian help is needed. I think we've done a lot, we as Poles, we as Europeans in general. And the last one, use post bello. In other words, the ethical principles that should be applied so that we can speak about just peace. It's about war reparations, for instance, in the context of Russia and Ukraine, how to delineate borders, how to punish those who perpetrated crimes during the war. This is a task very much ahead of us. Thank you. Still, perhaps if I may add a question about the idea of the punishment towards the war criminals. We look at the world, the way the world reacts to those crimes in Ukraine against the Ukrainian population. And additionally, some of the cases were taken to the international criminal courts. And, well, for the time being, it's difficult to speak about what's going to happen next. What is your perspective on that? Used post bellum. This is more about, perhaps, our hopes for the future, not about the current day. You could speak about an example, use post bellum of Japan. If someone has been able, perhaps, to prosecute criminals, war criminals. I think the case of Japan, the Americans' directions in Japan after the Second World War, this could be an example. It's different, perhaps, in the case of Germany, because it's difficult to speak about anything more than symbolic denazification. In Germany, many of the criminals actually had great careers in Germany after the Second World War. In Russia, we've got those symbolic examples. The arrest warrant for President Putin on the list of sanctions. We've got a number of Russian politicians. But, well, most remains to be done. it's ahead of us. There will be different also political interests in Europe and in the world. The global south will not be very much interested, I think, in punishing anyone in Russia. So at the level of the United Nations, of the Security Council, there's going to be probably a majority for no punishment. It's the case of Europe very much about what we'll be able to do here. There may be, I think, again, a symbolic limited number of criminals who will be punished. But let us, I think already now in Poland, Europe, about how to build the awareness, the social awareness of that used post-bellum after the Russian-Ukrainian war, so that we create better solutions that could serve as an example for the world. And the last comment, most probably, was going to be a significant barrier for this type of justice, is going to be the huge power, financial, economic, of the oligarchs, Russian oligarchs, unfortunately also some Ukrainian oligarchs. In Poland, we know very little about what this system is like, the oligarchs, politics, economy. We know very little about Ukrainian oligarchs as well. So difficult tasks facing us, and those great global interests of the Russian and Ukrainian oligarchy, I think they are going to pose a big barrier for peace in this part of Europe. And Dr. Machińska, how do you see that? In 2016, Russia decided to withdraw from the International Criminal Tribunal. This was the first signal that Russia is not going in the future to allow for the jurisdiction of this court. Ukraine has not joined this tribunal, has not ratified the documents founding the court, but signed declarations about the recognition of the jurisdiction of the International Criminal Tribunal, which means that it has the right to act in the context of the crimes perpetrated in the territory of Ukraine. The arrest warrant is not only a symbolic gesture. We have to make it clear today that the arrest warrant, that certainly is going to be very difficult to implement, but this is a very clear signal that Putin, Bielova, and also many others, that they are considered, or at least they are suspected of crimes, war crimes today by the International Criminal Court. Seeing those actions, their actions give rise to the suspicion that they are criminals, war criminals, and you don't negotiate with criminals. And this is not only an issue based in morality, but this is very much about the recognition of the role of the International Criminal Court. If we were to negotiate with criminals, those suspected of criminal action, and certainly there will be thousands of pieces of evidence on war crimes, this would be perhaps the end of this court, because if no action were to be taken, this would be the end of this institution. Voices negating their competence would be certainly against the future of the functioning of the International Criminal Court. Concluding now, I'm not sure if you have noticed that in May this year, the fourth summit of the Council of Europe was held in Reykjavik. And to a large extent, we speak about 46 countries of Europe. Russia was excluded from this council, as you know, and the summit was very much about the war. Very important decisions were taken at this meeting. The first was to come up with a register of losses. The Council of Europe is going to be responsible for the preparation of this register of losses in the territory of Ukraine. And the second focus was on the situation related to the children who were abducted by the Russians in Ukraine. There are, of course, international teams. Their focus is to assess the situation and collect evidence on the crimes perpetrated in Ukraine. If we today were to say that we want to have peace at any price, we have to focus, we have to stress that we speak about peace, just peace, and peace is about responsibility. Without responsibility, there may be no peace.
Dziękuję bardzo. To rzeczywiście jest, wydaje mi się, że zachęcałem, by tak zacząć od takiego zbliżenia na postawy ludzkie.
We can take a closer look, and we started with a closer look at the different human attitudes about the war, and now we moved to a different level. This is one of the areas we are very much interested in during this conference. The role of the International Criminal Court, the arrest warrant for Vladimir Putin. This is about very much whether we treat seriously international institutions such as the International Criminal Court, or do we believe that there may be some rights, some institutions of liberal democracy also in the international dimension. Can they be suspended, some of those rules, in extraordinary circumstances? I think it's also very much about Europe, what it's going to be like in the future. Is it going to treat those fundamental values as the foundation, or perhaps something different is going to prevail, some interests? There might be something perhaps considered more important. Let us see. Can I ask our guests from Ukraine again, Father Serhiy? What is the perspective of Ukraine here? Your outlook on Europe, the European Union, the democratic world, not only the Western European world, but in general. Yesterday, we asked Jan Olbrycht, member of European Parliament, about his outlook, and he said that this war perhaps is going to very much define the future of the European Union. Professor Dmytriyev said that it would be perhaps sooner or later necessary actually to negotiate with Putin. What is your position as a Ukrainian patriot? What is Ukraine actually fighting for, and what should the world and Europe know about this war before any action is taken towards building peace?
Trudne zapytanie.
Przepraszam.
A dla święciennika jeszcze trudniejsze.
Especially for a priest, I must say it's definitely a difficult question. The previous speakers, I think, were able to give a more expert answer to such a question. I will try to present an answer simply as an individual, as an average person, not an expert. Usually, when we look at Ukraine, we have a perspective of 1 year or a few years, but I think a long-term perspective is needed, not decades, but maybe centuries. Petlura, Piłsudski, because Ukraine was occupied by the Soviets already at that time in the 1920s. So our war fighting for independence in Ukraine goes back decades ago. It happened in Poland at that time, in the Baltic states. We still continue our fight for independence. We speak out against Soviet or Russian occupation, and we've been doing it for decades. The same goes for our church. The actions taken also in Poland, so-called Vistula action, with the forced resettlement of Ukrainians in the southeast of Poland, other terrible events related to the history of our country. We know what totalitarian regime is about. we also see our neighboring countries who managed to survive those difficult years of Soviet-Russian occupation. We know what Katyn is about, we know what Volhynia is about, and the events of 1940s there. We want to live in a democratic country when evil should be called evil, war should be called war, and when crimes are committed, those responsible for them should be held accountable. And I think every individual has the right to their religious denomination. You can be Muslim, Catholic, Orthodox. It's one's individual choice. We're very much for the freedom of religious denominations. We do not like the attitude in which some believe that you have to be members of the Orthodox Church because you are Slavs. And this is what we were fighting for since the times of the Maidan demonstrations. Zelensky is very much different from the previous presidents in Ukraine. We have created a democratic country. We've got our civic society that participates in the transformation of the country. When Yanukovych was president, actually he started using Ukrainian, speaking in Ukrainian publicly. So the Ukrainian society has a greater and greater impact on their country. There are a number of legislative changes as well, many of them initiated by the society at large. Also, the third sector is getting more and more important. The war, of course, is an impediment to our further transformations. Some say we must not now arrest Medvedchuk and some other oligarchs because we are in war and he finances some of the charitable actions, so we have to be careful not to lead to a political collapse. Some say that things cannot be done, changes are not possible because of the war that we participate in. As for anti-corruption programs, changes in the educational system, reforming our healthcare, much remains to be done. Our representatives have participated in trainings in different European countries. Many studied in different countries in the EU. I'm actually now paying into a special fund. My full salary goes to this fund that focuses on the help for the families of those who lost their lives fighting the Russians. Certainly more needs to be done. If not much more changes, we could have a similar situation to the one that happened in Poland in the late 1930s when the Germans and the Soviets divided Poland against them. In 1939, we had so many tragedies occurring in Poland at that time, the extermination of the Jews. I think the situation in Ukraine is quite similar now. If the Russian authorities see again that they can perpetrate so many terrible things without being held accountable for that, they will move on. I think that if Ukraine is still supported and joins the European family, it will be a process that will enrich Europe. Yes, very many Ukrainian refugees have been accepted here in Poland. I've visited Warsaw several times. I've never seen any people living in the streets. They have received accommodation as refugees. Many of them have jobs. Many of the people I know from Ukraine, they live now in Poland. Many from the people from Ukraine have arrived to Poland, some of them richer, some of them poorer, some of them perhaps who are also those who were unemployed or they were homeless. Well, everyone, irrespective of their social status, they were helped here in Poland. So I think we can draw many different conclusions from what has been done. The ideas, legal ideas, the law of European countries functions well, and we are building the future of Europe together, future of Europe based on Christian values. Everything that is said about our common values, about freedoms, those values can be found in the Holy Scriptures, the situation in which people consider money to be most important certainly is something that should not be the foundation of the legal order. Of course, finances, money, certainly it is also important, but there are other values that we have to use as the foundation for the future of our countries. And one more comment, if I may. At the time when the Russian troops were closing on Kiev, I got in contact with the company. Actually, they wanted to get 5 people out of Kiev. There was just one road that was open, not blocked yet. The Russian troops were very close to Kiev, and actually there was this one road that we could take where we needed also contacts with the local authorities, and we had to use a special password to be able to move along this line. Some even said 50,000 will be paid, but no, money was not enough. Money at that time did not save lives. It was not about bribes that some people wanted to pay. The focus was on humanity, on friendship, on contacts. 2 days ago, actually, we were able to help those families. Private contacts or bribes, they were not considered important at that time. Humanity, this was the most important dimension. Thank you very much.
Słusznie.
Yes, a round of applause is due.
Jest bardzo, moim zdaniem, być może ta wypowiedź była o tyle emblematyczna i ważna.
Now, what you've said is quite emblematic. Today in Europe, we are thinking hard about the European democracy, what it's going to look like, how threatened it is by a number of phenomena, mass migration, economics, politics, populism. And Father Serhiy has told us a story that shows that Europe can learn from Ukraine, because you had told us how for 100 years Ukraine has been striving for independence, for freedom. There is this ethical aspect to it. It's deeply humane. And Europe should actually be interested in that, how you strive for democracy, at times paying a price in human life. This is something that Europe can learn from Ukrainians. This is the first thing that I would like to say. Secondly, a question. Now we will wrap up this part of the panel and we shall have a Q&A, so if you have questions, think about it, because you'll have an opportunity to ask them soon. Now you, panelists, have said that Ukrainians and Poles have a lot in common, especially when it comes to their history, the fate of their nations. And we remember this message about Russian crimes committed, perpetrated by Russians on our grandparents. It's something that Poles still remember and something that you are experiencing, you Ukrainians, you're experiencing it right now. And also this experience of humanitarian help. Homeless people from Kiev can come to Kraków and live here. It's a difficult experience, but quite edifying at the same time. So the question is, let's look at this Polish-Ukrainian relationship. How do you see it shaping up in the next years? Because there is some resentment and possibly Russian agents are active too, spreading disinformation. So will that be pushing us towards growing animosity or indifference, possibly? Or rather, due to our memory, due to the shared experience on the part of Poles and Ukrainians rather, this relationship, this rapport will be growing stronger rather than weaker.
Proszę Państwa, ostatnie wypowiedzi polityków napawają nas ogromną troską, jeżeli chodzi o...
So I've been listening to recent interventions made by politicians, their speeches, and they make me concerned. Well, what they say and what they do is quite concerning. This is the pre-election period, and you see that politicians are becoming uncompromising in their actions, and I mean the Polish politicians here. These actions will have a major impact on the future of Ukrainians. I thought that Poland, by its very nature, is the kind of country that predestines us to give a strong support for Ukraine so that Ukraine may become a member of the EU. Yes, there is this community of history, of fate. We still remember what it's like to prepare ourselves for the EU accession. Professor Wyszyński is meeting Ukrainian judges now, and he is meeting their judges, including those of the Constitutional Tribunal, telling them how to act. Already today, Ukraine needs to start this work, despite the war. And the goal is the European Union. That's the goal. So, today I'm quite concerned. What we see being done and what we hear is actually, making this perspective of EU membership more distant. I'm quite concerned at what was happening in the public space. In the history of Poland and Ukraine, there have been dramatic moments. That is true. I know that. And still, these dramatic moments must not overshadow the fact that we need to act together and the fact that Ukraine is being bloodied. This is not the right time for historical settlements. You may not agree with me, but sooner or later it will have to be done. Historians do meet, and there has been this great initiative. It was the Council of Europe, I believe, and they've been preparing history textbooks. It was happening under the auspices of the Council of Europe. Polish-German history is what I have in mind at this point. And this is something that we must do. Education and then political actions, this is the path that we need to follow. We have a team of great experts on EU. It would be sinful not to use this potential. And yet, unfortunately, we hear what we're hearing before the elections, the Polish interest. But the Polish interest is the interest of Ukraine at this point. Our interests are common. In a moment, I'll pass the mic to Father Professor. But before I do, let me say the following. We may present demands to the politicians. They need to calm down, to quiet down the rhetoric, because what they are saying are quite dangerous, both what they say in bilateral discussions and at a global forum. We have to exert this pressure on politicians so that they do not push us away from Ukraine. Basically, I've always liked Ukrainians and Ukraine. I'm especially deeply moved when I look at the last 100 years of the Ukrainian history. I cannot think of another country, I mean a corner of the world, a land, where in 100 years so much blood, a sea of blood would have been spilled. The First World War, Bolshevism, its emergence, then communism, then Holodomor, the Great Hunger, 32-33, then World War II, and then communism, and then 30 years of Ukrainian statehood, and then wars again and bombs again, missiles, another war. I am not sure if there is another part of the world that would have experienced so much evil and barbarism in the last century. That makes me sympathize with Ukraine even more. Let's talk about the future, including our Polish-Ukrainian future. It's going to be very difficult indeed. Two things here. Two questions, rather. Number one, what has Ukraine been for the last 30 years? Why hasn't anyone helped Ukraine so that it could build a strong country, a strong political system? Ukraine has largely been robbed by the oligarchs, by various foreign investors. Recently, we've heard about those issues with grain. Who does the land belong to? Arable land. These would be foreign investment funds or Ukrainian oligarchs, and those people have various foreign passports, not to mention banking and the industry. I very much respect your desire to have democracy, but there is this question that is deeper in nature, namely who Ukraine belongs to. It's a system that's quite corrupt, international, oligarchical in nature, and it basically appropriated Ukrainian assets, and to bring it down would be quite difficult. First, we would need this international and Ukrainian plan to rebuild Ukraine, because ultimately a new country would have to be built in terms of the political system. Because at least partly those national assets would have to be rebuilt. You would have to build the healthcare system, educational system. It's a gargantuan challenge, and you would need international help. Without that help, you're not going to make it. I can agree with you, madam, because it is, historically speaking, a task for us, because we, I think, have this duty to participate in the process of recreating this Ukrainian state. But let me stress that it's going to be very hard work, a lot of toil, and it's going to last decades. We should not be naive here. We need to be very rational when we analyze this situation. We need a plan to reconstruct, rebuild the Ukrainian state. And the second challenge are our own historical problems, and they will be exploding before our eyes quite brutally. Volhynia is a symbol, but there are thousands of graves there. 100, maybe 200,000 citizens of the Second Polish Republic who were murdered in one way or another. Our citizens are buried somewhere. Now forests and grow there, fields are there. It is quite unprecedented. Well, maybe China is the only thing that is even worse, because in China tens of millions of people were murdered, and those victims, they have no monuments, there are no cemeteries. Those people lie somewhere there in the ground. And again, I agree with you, madam. What I'm saying is quite hard and difficult, but the right timing is needed, and the right form is needed to actually tackle that. And we need to help one another. We need to help each other. We need to help Ukraine when it comes to education, for example. Years will be needed to build this new historical awareness in Ukraine. At this point, it will be difficult to ask them to learn the details about Volhynia. So we have generations of Ukrainians that simply know nothing about it because it's a blank page in their history books. Nothing was said in the books, nothing was written about it and said on TV. So the historical awareness will have to be built from scratch, and it's take a lot of time. I wrote about it at length in a number of texts. It's not about exhuming victims, it's not about building graves. It is about building awareness, it's about education. Because if we start with cemeteries for the victims, it's like it is akin to building a house when you're beginning from the roof rather than foundations. So this is not the right way to go. You need to be very sensitive about it, morally. You need to be very wise and smart about it. And both Poles and Ukrainians must remember about it, because there will be, enemies that will be trying to divide us. And I hope that in the next years we're going to manage that. Right. Let me give the floor to you, ladies and gentlemen. Many hands raised. Maybe first row, and then we'll go to the right. Hello. Thank you. A very broad and emotional presentation of this important subject. How war impacts these human approaches. I've witnessed 3 wars, and I saw war and pain and violence. And these were not just arrows on the map. I saw what people did, how they helped, how humane and humanitarian they were, and they helped one another in helpless situations, and humanitarian aid that would flow. But I saw also different attitudes. I saw pathological behavior, and people would basically not accept this situation. I saw crime, and people are different, both good and evil. And the question to you, Serhiy. A lot of arms, guns, pistols, mortars have flown there. And one day the war will end. It will be some kind of an agreement, a truce. And there is this easy access to weapons there. Do you think that one day criminal behavior might explode and expand? We saw that in Afghanistan after the fall of USSR. But you had those mafias that you would see in Bosnia and Herzegovina. Are you already considering that, you as a civic society? Firstly, the difference between the wars that you have mentioned and our fight. We are fighting on our own land. We are not fighting in Russia. It's our soldiers that are fighting. These are mostly men that have families. They will become veterans in 10 years' time. We are talking about 600,000 people that are fighting. I also have a document that certifies that I did fight in the front lines. So I know how to handle weapons. Putin helped us. He raided Kiev. Basically, we're talking about 5 brigades. Many people who had access to arms. These people can go to a store, buy parts, and make weaponry. So what have we seen in the last years? Well, basically, the weapons are there. They are available. When it comes to how those weapons can be used by criminals, well, this is not a major phenomenon. It's not a major problem. Now, the people who were in the front lines, who fought, they were the people who were defending their own land. 2021, one of the combatants took a grenade and went to one of the ministerial offices. He was standing there with a grenade. The police were there, and he was asking the civilians to leave the building. He was suffering from PTSD, from a trauma, but he saw a woman. He asked this woman to leave. Ma'am, please leave. I'm holding a grenade. Move away as far from him as you can. So these are the things that have happened. And yes, such incidents have occurred. These were separate incidents, but even those traumatized people would always wait for civilians to leave. And yes, we have people who serve in special forces, special services. They will have a lot of weapon in their possession, and after the war, I'm sure that there will be a campaign to regain this weaponry. Another thing is the legal weapons, legal guns. Because, people may be in a very different mental state. They might be upset, and when you take out your weapon, take out your gun, it is not a good solution to a situation. Yes, in the future we will be thinking about it, but now war is being waged. When it comes to how we approach guns, we are very careful and cautious. So you don't see situations where people will be shooting one another in the streets, but we know that it might happen, and we will be working with that step by step. In a moment, questions, but remember that I'm the timekeeper, so please be brief when you are asking those questions.
We are going to have a number of questions asked, and then I will give the floor to our panelists again. Professor Stefan, please. Thank you. I also wish to thank you for this most passionate discussion. Very briefly, I would like to refer to what Reverend Professor Kobyliński has said, and also a question to Father Serhiy.
Też mieli ochotę na te pytania odpowiedzieć. W każdym razie
The others may also join in answering this question. It is always very difficult to come to terms with history, hold those responsible for crimes accountable. And in such situations, you always have to remember about a certain balance in the interpretation of history. We must not forget about what we did to Ukrainians and all the bad things we did to the Ukrainian minority in Poland before the Second World War. And as for other examples, for instance, China, also many problems. Another challenge, 3 million Polish Jews who died during the Second World War, and what happened to their cemeteries. Many disappeared. Many of the tombstones actually were used paving our streets. Sad reflection that I wanted to share with you. But still, if I may, direct question to Father Serhiy. It's about the future. It seems that it's important for all of us, because I myself, I am very much in favor of Ukrainians' accession into the EU as quickly as possible. Ukraine should become a full member of the EU. Of course, it requires great efforts, but at the same time, as we know, time is very much limited. This process should not take decades. 2030 is the current deadline. It's just a few years away from where we are now. There are huge transformation changes needed in Ukraine. Also, the construction of a true awareness, citizens' awareness, and change perhaps in the attitude towards what might seem a bit especially worrying in the European Union. This is what we keep on talking about. Corruption, unfortunately, this is what I have to mention. Problem of corruption, unfortunately, sometimes within the justice system as well. This is very worrying for many in the European Union. Can I perhaps ask the following question? What is the perspective, as you can see it, to change this system, to fight corruption, also to change the Ukrainian awareness? Is the war actually accelerating this process? I'm wondering, is there more and more pressure, social pressure on structures, national state structures, to help them create very strong foundations for a democratic country? So is this social awareness changing? Is the pressure more and more clearly felt? It's not the best time perhaps to create civic society, but I'm just wondering if such a phenomena can be seen in Ukraine. And one more question, if I may. I know my time is up. To what extent has the war actually stimulated the construction of the birth of a full identity, Ukrainian identity in this country? Let's have some more questions, more comments from the room, and then answers. Agnieszka Tombinska, 2 questions. The first about the refugees and the way they are welcome in Poland. In Poland, as Dr. Machińska mentioned it, we had individuals, private individuals, welcoming Ukrainian refugees in Poland. Very much different from the previous experience, international experience, where the special camps were created for refugees, lodgings outside communities. It seems that in the places where, if there were no private individuals helping refugees, then a number of problems are created. If we have refugees who are taken care of by private individuals, if those refugees feel that they were taken care of by concrete individuals, then the situation is very much different. Is there any international reflection, perhaps, of international institutions, that this experience shows how important it is to assist those people very directly by private individuals? And another, if I may, from the very beginning of this full-scale war, I've been trying to help Ukraine, but mainly focusing on helping Ukrainians in Ukraine. Today, this summer, I also organized some stays for widows and orphans in Poland. And some of them actually asked them, maybe we could come here to Poland and stay here. But no, actually I'm posing the question because I was just wondering at that time, what should we do actually? Should we really try to integrate those people, help them in some stays or during some stays? But if they do not want to return to Ukraine, this might lead to depopulation of the country. How to solve this challenge? Yes, one more question from here and one over there. Barbara de Winkler, Krakow. about 75% of people seem to be in support of Ukrainians staying in Poland, Ukrainian refugees. Well, it seems that unfortunately more and more people have developed a negative attitude towards Ukrainians. The support seems to be going down step by step. Some of them say that they drive cars that look too good, or they don't want to work, integrate with the labor market, and so on. When the war started, I also read an excellent book on the history of Ukraine by Professor Serhiy. And having read this book, I actually started to understand things better. I don't quite agree that Ukraine has been fighting for independence for 100 years. No, it's not true. From this book on the history of Ukraine, it's very clear, basically from the 10th century, Ukraine did not exist, of course, in the shape as it is now. But it seems that always in Ukraine, there have been such trends to make Ukraine independent. Maybe I will play the role of the devil's advocate now, but we betrayed actually Ukrainians so many times. We as Poles, there have been so many promises made by, for instance, Polish kings with regard to the Ukrainians, and they all have been broken. The Polish gentry, noblemen, killing Ukrainians, treating them as non-humans. I'm not saying that the events of Volhynia explain actually what happened, or they were justified, but let us remember that over centuries, we Poles, especially as in the context of our presence, Polish presence, maybe the noblemen, Polish noblemen in Ukraine, they were actually destroying Ukrainians for centuries. And my question now, I called the Solineum Publishing House. I sent an email to Znak asking why there are no new publications on the history of Ukraine and Poland. Of course, there are some books published, but focusing only on some elements of history. But if we want to understand the Ukrainians, my God, we should have better access to books on full Ukrainian history. The book I'm referring to was published originally in 1990. I think there are many who perhaps should take better care of publications. We have to find out more about Ukrainians, and I think not much will be changed without full knowledge on our part about Ukraine. And one more question, Member of the European Parliament, Mr. Albrecht. Referring to the subject matter of this panel discussion, I would like to change somewhat perhaps our perspective and also ask a question that will also refer to the subject matter of the next panel discussion, especially referring to priest Kobyliński. What is going to happen if Russia attacks Poland, if there is a war breaking out here in Poland, in the context of our behavior towards the refugees? So are we prepared? So the war is in the neighboring countries, it's not on the moon. The question is, Professor, how do you think, what would be the behavior of the Polish society if we are attacked by Russia? And what would you tell Poles if the Russians were to attack Poland? What to do, how to behave? Would we be able to show solidarity for us Poles? We are showing solidarity to the Ukrainians, but today, well, if you can hear the sirens wailing, you might think that this is about some anniversary, not a real conflict. It seems we are talking about Ukraine as if Ukraine were on the moon.
Bardzo proszę krótko, dobrze? A dwóch panów jeszcze jest.
Very brief question, please. Yes. Two questions, very briefly. My question is about hatred. Ukraine, from your perspective, how are the Ukrainians managing hatred? Of course, we understand hatred. It's perhaps indispensable in the context of mobilization of the society, but at the same time, it's traumatizing very much the whole society, Ukrainian society. Yes, a brief question and another very brief question, please. Really the last one. Question also to Father Serhiy. The question about people under occupation, 10 years of occupation, Donbass, Crimea. As we know, the Russian propaganda is very active. what are we going to do after the occupation if those territories are regained? What is going to happen? I don't know, to have a new generation, perhaps. The young generation has been brought out under great influence of Russian propaganda. How are we going to change those people? What's going to happen? And what's the role of the church is going to be and priests in the future? Well, I should give at least 15 minutes to all our panelists, but unfortunately our time is limited. We need to remember about our timeline. So actually I can give maybe 3 minutes at most to each of our panelists, up to 3 minutes for everyone. Is it enough? No, the organizers are telling me that 3 minutes for everyone is too much. Maybe a minute or so for everyone. Sorry for that. Yes, Father Serhiy, most of the questions were addressed to you. On the 21st of April 2020, we had an agreement signed, 1920, sorry, I apologize, correcting myself, 1920, the contract between Piłsudski, Poland, and Petlura, Ukraine. I'm referring to one of the questions. Yes, corruption is a huge task, a big challenge for all of us. This is one of the reasons for the war, so I think that this has to be done. Yes, we are working on this. If we join the EU in the whole process of negotiations, consultations, this is one of the most significant challenges for all of us. Thanks to the help, I think, of also Europeans, we are going to overcome corruption in our country. As for the next question about what we can do, what we can achieve, perhaps, and how to change those people who have been for over 10 years under occupation. Many of those people have already left. Many are running out of those region. They move away. They don't want to serve in the Russian military, so many of them actually have already left. Because we are in touch with the people who are still living there. Many of the Ukrainians are waiting for the liberation. Some of them started collaborating with Russia also in the Crimea. I think they will leave Crimea once those areas are liberated. But as for hatred, as for psychology, well, me, myself, my family, we are also using the support of psychologists. As priests, we support also one another. I think hatred is something normal under the current circumstances. It's what happens, I think, in such difficult circumstances to all of us. Yes, I realize there are negative emotions. I also feel them, but I try to come to terms with them and somehow overcome them. I'm not sure I've been able to take down all the questions that have been asked. I'll give the floor to the other panelists, but of course I am willing to speak to everyone individually. Please come and join me if you have further questions. Well, Civius pacem parabellum. The Romans already said that you have to prepare for the war if you want peace. I think this is the reply to the question asked by the member of the European Parliament. And as for this preparation for war, it's quite limited, I'm afraid, here in this country. There were some studies conducted about who in Poland actually would be willing to take up weapons and fight for the fatherland. Quite surprising results, I think. Just a dozen or so of the young people who declared that they would be ready to fight in defense of their homeland here in Poland. And I'm afraid that this has not changed very much. So I'm not sure we are ready for the war. I think education, patriotic social education, political also is very much needed here. Apart from the preparation of the military, the army, the tanks, the aircraft, I think we need also to shape the mentality of the people, education. This certainly is going to be very much needed, but not easy at the same time. And one perhaps comment to conclude what I especially deeply regret, well, even this terrible war in a neighboring country, it does not unfortunately change our internal conflict, war you might even call it in Poland. The supporters of two leading political parties hating more and more each other. And this internal conflict and internal hatred in Poland, actually, it's not going down, this level of hatred, but it seems to be going up. We are now within the electoral campaign, but I think it might be even worse after the election. We will see. This is a big challenge, I think, for all of us, for the politicians, the clergy, the media. How is it actually possible that in Poland, in the heart of Europe, we have such a society that is deeply divided into two different tribes, you might say. And when faced with a real conventional war in the neighboring country, those two tribes somehow are not changing their attitudes and enmity. Ladies and gentlemen, maybe if I may still more about this division in the two tribes. Two borders, two different attitudes, the Polish-Ukrainian border and the Polish society doing so much, doing anything possible to help Ukrainians. And the other border between Poland and Belarus, what are we doing? 54% of those asked say that yes, we want to throw out those people who try to enter Poland running away from conflict, but these are distant wars. We don't care about those wars. We say that we protect the Schengen border, but what do? We actually, in a very brutal way, we, the authorities, actually, we trample the human rights of those people, and we say, well, the border is there, we have to protect our border. So when we speak about wars, we have to speak about different attitudes of our citizens, also different attitudes of our authorities. Unfortunately, the current authorities, people currently in power, I have to accuse them of introducing legislation that is not true legislation. Practices have been introduced that are not human practices, and propaganda is very much used that actually very much damages our minds. To Professor Safian, yes, this is something that is something we should be actually ashamed of. Yes, the Jewish cemeteries that are no longer there. Yes, education is needed, very clearly. But I think the European Union is too passive at this moment. Too passive, not enough is being done, and we are not able to present our position clearly. We've got problems in the negotiations. Perhaps we are not able to actually force the EU to act in the context of migration policy. And what we find especially most painful is the war very close to us. But let us remember about those more distant wars further away from us, and let us remember about the fate of those people that are coming to us in dramatic circumstances. And we as citizens, those fantastic activists, are doing so much for those people, the young people, older people who are trying to help those people trying to enter Poland from Belarus. About 50 people died in the Polish forests. We would have more of deaths were it not for those people who are true heroes for me, to support them.
Nie mam już nic do dodania, myślę. Bardzo mocno wybrzmiały tutaj wszystkie najważniejsze wątki tej rozmowy. Nie mam już nic do dodania, myślę.
I've got nothing more to add. The most important elements of this discussion have been well shaped. And now a break, 13 minutes.